All right, welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
So today, we're tackling something pretty ambitious. We've got this huge stack of sources, right? Covering everything from, like, 19th century railroad tycoons.
Right up to modern AI funding wars and, well, some big Silicon Valley blowups, too.
Exactly. And the goal here, our mission, if you like, is to try and find the real engine, the sort of hidden driver behind building these massive lasting fortunes and, frankly, power.
Yeah, because the usual story is all about the invention, isn't it? The next big thing, the killer product.
Right. But we're asking, what if that's not the whole picture? What if the real secret sauce, the thing that really builds empires, isn't the product itself, but the process, the way it's all structured and run?
It's really the thread connecting all these diverse sources. We look at these giants, these titans from the Gilded Age or today's tech world, and honestly, they rarely got there just by inventing something totally new. Their real genius, often, was in inventing a better way. A better way to structure the business, manage the money, use scale, drive efficiency, stuff that competitors just weren't thinking about in the same way.
So this deep dive, it's about peeling back those layers, getting past the flashy product launch, and looking at the operational plumbing, the financial engineering.
The unseen strategies, exactly.
Okay, so we're not just hunting for clever ideas. We're looking for the people who mastered scale, who understood logistics down to the penny, who knew how to play the financial game, and sometimes how to navigate or maybe even bend the market rules and regulations.
Right. And for you, the listener, the goal is to really unpack these stories. See where things like efficiency, distribution muscle, or smart financial plays ended up being way more powerful than just having a neat invention.
Okay, let's dig in then. Where do we start? Well, if we're talking process innovation, maybe the most fundamental place to start is just pure operational execution, getting a simple, repeatable system down perfectly.
And you almost have to start with McDonald's there. It's become such a cliche, but it's fundamental. Ray Kroc. He didn't invent the hamburger, obviously,
No.
or even fast food. But he saw what the McDonald brothers were doing in their original San Bernardino stand.
And he had that light bulb moment.
Yeah. He was absolutely convinced that the key was the process. He believed, and the source quotes this, that anybody could do it if he followed those individual steps to the letter.
So the breakthrough wasn't culinary, it was systematic, standardized.
Completely. Making food quickly, consistently at huge volume. That was the core operational process. But Kroc's second stroke of genius was how he structured the business around that process.
Right, because just owning thousands of restaurants directly, that gets messy fast.
Exactly. He knew that a purely top-down corporate structure, managing thousands of these places, especially with high staff turnover, would become, this is his word, unwieldy and counterproductive.
So the owner-operator model.
That was the key. That famous internal slogan, in business for yourself, but not by yourself. That's not just a nice phrase. It's a core process innovation for managing scale.
How so? Explain that a bit more.
Well, think about it. You inject local ownership, local passion, real skin in the game into every single outlet. That owner cares deeply because it's their livelihood.
Right, they're motivated.
Hugely motivated. But, and this is crucial, that local motivation, that independence, is tightly bound by the corporate rule book. The procedures, the suppliers, the menu, the quality standards, all dictated centrally.
Okay, so it's decentralized incentive, but centralized control over the actual process.
Precisely. It's this brilliant tension. You get the energy of entrepreneurship, but the efficiency and consistency of a massive, centrally planned system. That's why McDonald's scaled globally in a way that a purely top-down chain probably couldn't have, or certainly not as quickly.
That's fascinating. Okay, so from fast food standardization to mass retail, let's talk about Sam Walton and Walmart. He feels like a kindred spirit in this obsession with process.
Oh, absolutely. Walton wasn't an inventor either. He was, maybe more than anything, a master of what we now call competitive intelligence and efficiency auditing, really.
He wasn't just building his stores, he was constantly studying everyone else's.
Relentlessly. The sources say he treated rivals like Kmart as a laboratory. He wasn't just competing, he was dissecting. He'd drive for hours, walk their aisles.
Just watching.
No, actively probing, asking employee, pointed questions.
Yeah.
How often does this turn over? What's your cost on that? How does your distribution work?
Wow. So basically, industrial espionage on the retail floor.
You could call it that. But the goal was always efficiency. He was doing this constant real-time audit of where his competitors were weak, where their costs were higher, where their logistics lagged. And then he'd go back and just systematically attack those areas in his own operations.
And the outcome of all that obsessive focus wasn't just a bigger company, it was a quantifiable benefit for the consumer, right? That cemented their position.
That's the crucial link. Walton himself talked about this. He estimated that Walmart's sheer process efficiency, better logistics, lower overhead, smarter buying saved customers, about 10% on average compared to competitors.
10%, that sounds significant.
It's huge when you factor in the scale. Think about the period from, say, 1982 to 1992. Walmart's average annual sales were around $13 billion.
Oh.
A 10% saving on $13 billion a year, over 10 years. That's $13 billion. Not in Walmart's pockets, but back in the pockets of American consumers.
Just from being better at the process of retail.
Exactly. Built purely on logistical mastery, cost control, operational efficiency, not on inventing some revolutionary new product. It shows how process excellence can be this incredible force multiplier, often bigger than just having a slightly better product.
Okay, that idea of scale becoming a weapon in itself, that takes us right into the modern era, and inevitably, Amazon.
Yes, the heir to that logistical throne in many ways.
In the early 2000s, Jeff Bezos was already talking about the unstore. He was focused on decentralization, independent decision-making within the company. He explicitly argued against traditional hierarchy.
He said, a hierarchy isn't responsive enough to change, which is a core belief about process design, right?
Right.
How do you structure the organization itself for speed and adaptation?
And did that philosophy translate into real-world leverage? How did Amazon use its operational structure as a weapon?
Oh, definitely. Bezos understood early on that once you hit a certain critical mass, a certain volume, your process becomes your leverage. Your scale itself is the negotiating tool, sometimes even more than having lots of alternatives.
Okay, let's make that concrete. The source mentions the UPS contract renewal back in 2002. That sounds like a key moment.
It was, because think about it. At that point, Amazon didn't have many great shipping alternatives.
Yeah.
Really, it was just the U.S. Postal Service, USPS.
Who don't really negotiate bulk rates in the same way.
Exactly. So on paper, Amazon looked like they were cornered. Minimal leverage, right?
Seems like it.
But Jeff Wilk, who led those negotiations for Amazon, managed to pull off one of their first major bulk discounts from UPS. A huge win.
How? If they had no real alternative.
Because Amazon's volume was already so massive even back then, that UPS kind of needed Amazon's business almost as much, or maybe even more, than Amazon needed that specific deal with UPS. Amazon's scale, their sheer operational throughput, had become structurally important to the carrier.
Ah, I see. So their size itself created leverage, even without a competing offer on the table.
Precisely. The source puts it bluntly, calling it the reality of Darwinian survival in the world of big business. Your operational scale becomes an undeniable force. Volume is power.
Okay, that's logistics power.
Yeah.
But Amazon's process innovation wasn't just about shipping boxes cheaper, was it? They made some really bold, some might say risky bets that involved changing their entire operational footprint. Like the Kindle.
Absolutely. The Kindle decision is fascinating from a process perspective because building hardware, that was completely new territory for them.
Yeah, they were a software and logistics company, essentially.
Right. And the source says developing the Kindle forced them into expensive, complicated hardware manufacturing, something well outside of Amazon's core competency.
Must have been huge internal pushback on that.
Oh, yeah. The source mentions a chorus of vehement objections from inside the company. Executives like Wilk, the logistics guy we just talked about, apparently foresaw all the headaches. Supply chain nightmares, debugging issues, production delays.
I mean, that sounds incredibly risky. Betting the company's focus on something you're not good at. That seems like a recipe for disaster for most companies. How did Bezos justify that gamble?
Because the goal wasn't just to sell a device. It wasn't about becoming a great hardware manufacturer per se.
What was it about them?
It was about controlling the process of digital distribution, specifically for books initially, but you could see the potential for music, movies, everything.
Controlling the ecosystem, the
Yeah.
platform.
Exactly. They were willing to take the financial hit, the operational pain, the short-term manufacturing fumbles, because owning the platform, the process by which people discovered, bought, and consumed digital content, was seen as strategically far more valuable in the long run than just sticking to their profitable knitting in e-commerce and logistics.
So tolerate short-term process pain for long-term process control.
That's the Bezos playbook, isn't it? The source notes he's not deterred by short-term setbacks. He saw those hardware manufacturing losses and headaches not as failures, but as investments. Necessary costs to build the infrastructure for future dominance in digital content delivery. That's thinking about process at a highly strategic level.
Okay, so the lesson is about centralizing control over the core method, the platform, even if you decentralize parts of the execution, and being willing to endure pain to secure that strategic control. What happens when that method isn't about physical goods, but about information flow, about software standards? That takes us from logistics into the digital realm and the big platform wars. Microsoft comes to mind immediately.
Right. And Bill Gates. His competitive drive was legendary, even early on. The environment at Microsoft was sometimes described, maybe dramatically, as management by crisis. Oh. Always pushing, always aiming to set the standard.
Let's look at that critical fight with IBM. IBM was huge, their partner initially, but then IBM decided they wanted their own standard, right? They developed their own operating system environment.
Yeah, they wanted to move away from Microsoft's MS-DOS and control the future themselves. They developed something called Top View.
Top view, okay.
And you have to understand, if IBM, with its massive market power back then, had succeeded in making Top View the standard for PCs.
It would have shut Microsoft out.
Completely. And
Yeah.
not just Microsoft, but pretty much every other independent software company, too.
Right.
You would have created a closed IBM ecosystem.
Right.
Gates saw this immediately as an existential threat.
So how did he fight back? He couldn't outmuscle IBM directly?
No, his strategy wasn't about technical superiority alone. It was, frankly, political and structural genius.
Yeah.
The source says he fought back like a Chinese warlord. What he did was forge alliances.
Alliances. With who?
With IBM's competitors. He went out and rallied 24 other major computer manufacturers, companies like Compaq, Texas Instruments, HP, Zenith, Burroughs, DEC, a huge coalition.
Okay, why would all these rivals team up with Microsoft against IBM?
Because none of them wanted IBM, their biggest competitor, dictating the rules of the game either. Gates offered them an alternative. Windows. A platform that wasn't controlled by their main rival, a platform they could all build hardware for relatively freely.
Ah, so he created a counter-coalition, an open standard, or at least a non-IBM standard, versus IBM's closed one.
Exactly. He built an industry consensus around Windows, effectively neutralizing IBM's push with TopView. It wasn't just about code. It was about structuring the market, a process innovation in building an ecosystem that outmaneuvered IBM's sheer size and history. That's process thinking at the industry level.
But that ecosystem strategy doesn't always work, does it? We see Microsoft try to replicate Apple's integrated model later on. Gates had criticized Apple for controlling both hardware and software.
Right, the classic apple-walled garden approach.
But then Microsoft tries to do something similar with the Zune, their answer to the iPod. And it was a famous flop.
A spectacular flop, really. 2 years after it launched in 2006, the Zune had captured less than 5% of the market. It barely made a dent.
Why did it fail so badly when the iPod succeeded? Was the product just worse?
Maybe partly, but the deeper issue, according to this framework, is process and cultural fit. Apple's vertical integration, designing the hardware, the software, the service, the retail experience that was baked into their company DNA from the start.
Okay.
Microsoft's DNA was completely different. It was built on licensing software, partnering with hardware makers, enabling others. When they tried to force this integrated hardware-software process with the Zune, they just didn't have the right internal culture, the design chops, the manufacturing relationships, the retail instincts.
So you can't just copy-paste a successful process from one company culture to another.
It often doesn't work, no. It highlights that successful process strategy needs to align with the organization's inherent strengths and culture. Just mimicking a competitor isn't enough.
Okay, let's shift gears from company battles to global competition. The race in artificial intelligence, AI, feels like the ultimate process war today, especially between the US and China.
It absolutely is. And for China, there was a distinct turning point, described in the sources as their Sputnik moment.
What triggered that?
It was in 2017 when Google DeepMind's AlphaGo defeated Qiji, the world's top Go player. That single event apparently sent shockwaves through the Chinese leadership.
Really? Just a game?
It symbolized the potential power and advancement of Western AI. It galvanized the central government almost immediately. They released this massive national blueprint aiming for global AI leadership by 2030. Became a top-level, centrally planned process goal.
And the stakes are enormous, economically speaking.
Huge. Estimates suggest AI deployment could add something like $15.7 trillion to global GDP by 2030. That's just mind-boggling.
And China expects a big slice of that pie.
The predictions are that China could capture around $7 trillion of that value. That's nearly double the projection for North America, which is around $3.7 trillion.
Wow. Okay, so what structural advantages does China have in this race? How is their process for developing AI different or potentially faster?
Well, several things. First, the sources point to genuinely world-class entrepreneurs and tech talent. That's table stakes now. Second, there's very proactive government support.
Money, basically.
Yes, direct subsidies for AI startups, but also massive, generous government contracts. This helps companies scale quickly, gets AI implemented in real-world scenarios, and crucially, generates vast amounts of data, which is the fuel for AI.
Okay, talent and funding. What else? There was something about knowledge transfer being different.
Yes, this is maybe the most interesting process innovation. China is training this huge army, as the source calls it, of engineers,
Yeah.
but it's how they absorb and share knowledge that's striking.
How does that work?
They leverage the global open research culture to an extreme degree. Academic papers published online anywhere in the world, they're dissected almost instantly. Top AI approaches are debated in real time in huge specialized groups on WeChat.
So it's like a massive ongoing online study group.
Kind of, but supercharged. They stream lectures from top U.S. universities directly to engineers' phones. It's not the old model of waiting for conferences or quarterly journals. It's this continuous, rapid, peer-to-peer absorption and dissemination of the latest knowledge across the entire sector. That sheer velocity of learning and iteration could be a significant process advantage.
Okay, that's a picture of massive, state-backed, highly efficient systems being built. Let's flip the coin now and look at the dark side. The illusion of process, the illusion of disruption. Theranos.
Right, a stark cautionary tale. Elizabeth Holmes was brilliant at projecting that Silicon Valley visionary image, hyper-optimism. The sources mention her frequent use of the term extraordinary. She clearly believed that sort of evangelizing was just part of the startup founder's job description.
Necessary to get funding, to get partnerships.
Exactly. But the problem was, the vision was built on an operational reality that was completely fictional. The technology didn't work as claimed.
And the process failure here was prioritizing the image over the actual operational truth.
Critically so. There's a chilling example. A colleague apparently confronted Holmes, pointed out fundamental problems with the technology, and suggested pausing a key study in Tennessee to fix the machines. A totally rational operational step.
And Holmes's reaction?
Flat rejection.
Eh.
Worse, she reportedly told the colleague to basically reconsider if Theranos was the right place for her.
Wow. Punishing the messenger.
Effectively, yes. Preserving the illusion, the narrative, was more important than fixing the broken process. That's a catastrophic failure of process management.
And this need to maintain the illusion led to physical acts of concealment, right? Hiding the reality from partners and regulators.
Yes. Partners like Walgreens were denied any real access to the labs to verify things for themselves, and the secrecy became formalized internally.
Oh, so?
There's an account of an inspection by the California Department of Public Health. Employees apparently got an internal directive which they understood clearly meant, do not let the inspector see what's behind the door to the downstairs lab.
The Normandy lab.
The Normandy lab, which is where they kept the actual proprietary Theranos devices, the ones that didn't really work, hidden away. By physically diverting the regulator, by hiding the core non-functional process technology, they kept the whole facade going for longer. It shows that sometimes process innovation can just be a euphemism for elaborate, structured deception.
That leads us directly into the world of finance, where the process isn't necessarily about building a physical product or even code, but about structuring deals, moving capital, and mastering the market's plumbing.
Exactly. And the 1980s M&A boom, the whole barbarians at the gate era, is a prime example. Wall Street figured out that takeovers were, as the source puts it, one guaranteed source of income. Why? Because they collected huge fees, win, lose, or draw, just for orchestrating the deals.
The process itself generated the fees, regardless of the outcome for the actual companies involved.
Pretty much. And the defining process innovation of that era was the leverage buyout, the LBO.
Explain that simply. How does an LBO work as a process?
Okay, so in an LBO, the buyer, often a specialized buyout firm, purchases a company using mostly borrowed money, debt. They put up maybe only 10% of the price in actual cash, equity, and borrow the other 90%.
90% debt. Wow.
Yeah. The bet is that the target company's own future profits, its cash flow, will be enough to pay back all that borrowed money over time.
So the process is about maximizing leverage, using as little of your own money as possible, and then making the acquired company pay off the debt used to buy it.
That's the basic mechanism, and because you've loaded the company with so much debt, you absolutely have to make it more efficient or at least strip out costs very quickly.
Which leads to things like selling off assets.
Exactly. Look at the RJR Nabisco LBO battle. The bidding got intense. The Shearson team, trying to put together a winning offer, famously targeted CEO Roth Johnson's legendary corporate perks. They called it napalming his playthings.
What kind of thing?
The fleet of corporate jets, the fancy penthouses, the exclusive country club memberships, even the lavish Atlanta headquarters building, all that stuff was marked for elimination in their plan.
So the process innovation wasn't about making better cookies or cigarettes.
No, it was about identifying and monetizing perceived corporate waste, turning those non-essential assets into cash to help justify the massive debt load needed to do the deal. It's financial process optimization.
And the fuel for this entire LBO machine, this whole process, was largely provided by one individual, Michael Milken.
Milken was the master of a specific financial process innovation: junk bonds, high-yield bonds. Before him, it was very hard for riskier companies or for buyout firms needing huge amounts of debt to raise that kind of money.
So he created a market for riskier debt.
He essentially created the liquidity for it. He analyzed the risks, packaged these bonds, and found buyers for them, making vast amounts of capital available for takeovers and for companies that couldn't get funding through traditional banks or investment-grade bond markets.
His impact was huge then.
Enormous. The sources say he was arguably the single biggest force behind the massive run-up in stock prices in the 80s, pushing the Dow Jones average over 2,700. He fundamentally changed the process of how corporate control was financed and contested, a true financial process revolutionary.
But this kind of high-level financial engineering often seems to bleed into, well, influencing the rules of the game itself, bending the regulatory process, what some call crony capitalism.
Yes, that's a recurring theme, especially in certain economies. The sources talk about godfathers in parts of Asia, powerful business figures who seem to operate almost above the normal legal and regulatory structures.
How does that happen? Is it outright corruption?
Sometimes, but often it's described as a political failure to consistently enforce the existing rules, especially when powerful interests are involved. The process breaks down or is selectively applied.
Okay, give us an example of this regulatory process bending.
The case of Li Ka-shing in Hong Kong is cited. Now, Hong Kong has clear stock market rules. One key rule is that if you inco your ownership stake in a company above 35%, it triggers a mandatory general offer you have to offer to buy out all the other shareholders at the same price. It's meant to protect minority investors.
Seems fair, standard practice in many markets.
Right. Yet the source states Li received a long series of often inexplicable exemptions from this very rule over the years.
Inexplicable, meaning no clear reason was given.
Pretty much. It happened when his company Hutchison took over Hong Kong Electric. It happened when Hutchison bought more of Cavendish. It happened multiple times when Li personally increased his stake in his flagship company, Chung Kong. Even during the big IPO of Tom.com, allies reportedly got special allocations of shares and options.
So the standard regulatory process just didn't apply.
It seemed to bend. The implication is that the system, perhaps to maintain stability or favor the most powerful local players, allowed for exemptions that wouldn't typically be granted. The regulatory process itself became flexible, depending on who was involved. Power shaped the process.
The scale of this kind of thing can be staggering. Look at the Salim Group in Indonesia after the Asian financial crisis. They owed the government a huge amount of money, right?
An absolutely astronomical sum. Around 53 trillion Indonesian rupiah, which was about $6.6 billion back then. This was for emergency central bank credits they'd received during the crisis to stay afloat.
So how did they settle that $6.6 billion debt? Did they pay it back?
Not exactly. They negotiated a deal. They handed over about 100 of their domestic companies to the government's bank restructuring agency, known as IBRA.
Okay, so assets for debt.
Yes, but here's the kicker. When IBRA eventually sold off those assets, they only managed to recover about 2/5, maybe 40% of the original debt owed.
So the government took a massive loss.
A huge loss. But despite that, and despite not repaying the full amount, the Salines faced no prosecution. They actually retained control of hundreds of other companies, including huge profitable ones like the Bogasari flour mills and Indofood. And then the government just announced the debts were considered settled.
Wow. The political process essentially absorbed the loss and let the financial architects keep their core empire intact.
That's how it appears. The process shielded them from the full consequences.
This kind of structural lack of accountability or finding ways around the rules wasn't just an Asian phenomenon. It was arguably central to the lead-up to the 2008 financial crisis, too. Look at SIC Capital.
Right. Stephen Cohen's hedge fund. There was significant evidence, the sources say, pointing to a culture of insider trading at the firm. But crucially, they had strong mechanisms in place to protect Cohen himself.
How did that protection process work? What were the mechanisms?
It involved creating layers of insulation. One specific process mentioned was the use of numbered conviction ratings.
Conviction ratings.
Yeah. An analyst might get a potentially illegal inside tip about a stock. Instead of forwarding the raw tip, they'd process it, analyze it, and then assign a numerical rating, say a 5 for high conviction, high certainty this was actionable information. That number, not the original sensitive source, would be communicated upwards.
Ah, so it launders the information, creates distance between the leader making the trade decision and the potentially illegal source.
Exactly. It's a process designed to create plausible deniability, insulating the top decision makers from direct knowledge of the illicit sourcing of the tips, a structural defense mechanism.
And then we saw the catastrophic failure of risk management processes play out in real time in 2007 with Bear Stearns. Two of their big hedge funds imploded.
Yeah, funds heavily invested in subprime mortgage debt. They were once valued at over $20 billion combined, and then almost overnight they became, quote, essentially worthless.
A total wipeout. What's interesting is the debate that happened afterwards about the process of handling that failure.
Yes. Stephen Schwartzman, head of Blackstone and someone with deep experience advising companies, apparently saw the systemic danger. He recognized the huge reputational hit Bear Stearns was taking.
And he advised their CEO, Jimmy Kane, to do what?
He told Kane, basically, write a check, make the investors whole. Even though Bear Stearns wasn't legally obligated to cover those hedge fund losses, Schwartzman argued it was essential to protect the firm's reputation, its franchise value.
Which, for an investment bank, reputation is everything, right? Seems like sound advice.
You'd think so. But Kane's response was reportedly instant and brutal. He rejected the advice, supposedly saying, I'm not writing any checks. This game is for grown-ups.
Wow. This game is for grown-ups.
Chilling, isn't it? The focus was purely on the legal letter, the immediate financial cost, avoiding setting a precedent. Zero value placed on the long-term reputational process or the trust of the market. That decision, that mindset, is often cited as a key factor contributing to Bear Stearns' ultimate collapse just months later. The process for handling failure failed.
You know, to really grasp these modern strategies, the financial engineering, the regulatory capture, the platform control, it's incredibly useful to look back at the originals, the 19th century titans who wrote the playbook for structural dominance.
Absolutely. They didn't have computers or complex derivatives, but they understood process and power instinctively. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, he was the absolute master of logistics, transportation, and what the source calls competitive outlawry.
Outlawry, that's a strong word. What did it mean in practice?
It meant ruthless, predatory price wars. Vanderbilt used this term himself. He wasn't just lowering fares to attract more customers, he was slashing prices with the specific process goal of crippling or destroying his rivals.
A weaponized process.
Totally. There's an example where the New York Herald reported that the Stonington Railroad stock price was plummeting, more seriously affected than any other. Why? Because its business relied heavily on passengers traveling through routes that Vanderbilt controlled, and he was just undercutting them mercilessly on those feeder lines.
And Vanderbilt often talked about believing in free markets, right? Unfettered trade and unrestrained competition.
He definitely used that rhetoric. But you have to understand, for him, competition wasn't the goal. It was the process he used to achieve his real goal.
Which was?
What the source calls a satisfactory and profitable equilibrium, which in Vanderbilt's dictionary almost always meant a monopoly or near monopoly where he controlled the pricing. Competition was just the temporary chaos needed to establish his order.
And he wasn't afraid to demonstrate that power, Raleigh. The story of him cutting off the New York Central Railroad is legendary.
It really is. The New York Central was a major line, but it depended on Vanderbilt's tracks for the final crucial connection into New York City. When they displeased him, he simply cut them off, stopped accepting their traffic.
Even though his own son pleaded with him not to, right? Fearing the public reaction.
Yeah, his son William begged him, but the Commodore was adamant. He wanted to make a point. He wanted the Central and everyone else to understand who controlled the bottleneck.
And the effect.
Devastating for the Central. They suddenly could not go before the public and say she was a grand trunk line between New York and Buffalo because they couldn't get to New York. Vanderbilt controlled the final, essential step in their process. It's the 19th century version of controlling the App Store or the final mile delivery mastery of the choke point in the distribution process gives you immense power.
So Vanderbilt mastered transportation access. What about John D. Rockefeller? His empire was built on oil, but his genius was also process, wasn't it? Supply chain mastery.
Absolutely meticulous process control. Rockefeller obsessed over efficiency at every stage. One key innovation was his use of the tank wagon system for retail distribution.
Tank wagons, like delivering oil directly.
Exactly. Instead of selling barrels of refined oil to independent middlemen and stores, Standard Oil invested heavily in its own fleet of horse-drawn tank wagons. They delivered kerosene directly to small retail customers, door to door almost.
Why was that so powerful?
It gave him direct control over the retail price. It cut out the middlemen's profit margins, and it enabled his most lethal weapon, according to the source, routine underselling.
Meaning he could just dump oil cheaply wherever he faced competition.
Precisely. Because Standard Oil was already the lowest cost refiner due to incredible efficiency upstream, they could afford to sell kerosene at or even below cost in specific towns to drive out local competitors. His vertically integrated process, from wellhead to tank wagon, meant he could sustain losses longer than anyone else.
And Rockefeller had a justification for this, didn't he? He didn't just say, I want a monopoly.
No, he framed it almost morally. He argued he only cut prices defensively in response to independents who were cutting prices first. He basically said, and the quote is famous, these people did not want cooperation, they wanted competition. And when they got it, they didn't like it.
So the justification was, my process is superior, more efficient. The market should eliminate the less efficient. It's almost a social Darwinist view of business process.
That's a very good way to put it. His structure, his process, was inherently better. Therefore, its dominance was natural and justified, even if achieved through brutal price wars.
Okay, finally, let's touch on that inherent tension between the person who designs the financial structure and the person who runs the actual operations. Carnegie and Frick.
Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, and Henry Clay Frick, his hard-nosed operational chairman. Their relationship crystallizes this power dynamic, especially during the infamous Homestead strike and lockout in 1892.
Frick was the one on the ground, right? Managing the plant, dealing with the unions, making the tough calls that led to the violence.
Yes, Frick was the operational commander, implementing Carnegie's demand for cost cuts, which meant breaking the union. It was Frick who hired the Pinkerton Guards. The operational crisis was squarely in his lap.
But where was Carnegie, the architect of the empire?
Thousands of miles away, vacationing in a castle in Norway. But distance didn't mean detachment from the core strategy. He was fully briefed and gave Frick his unequivocal backing via cable.
What did he say?
He cabled his full support, telling Frick, essentially, stick to the plan, don't give in. He emphasized, we shall win, of course, but may have to shut down for months. The strategic decision, the willingness to endure operational disruption to achieve the financial goal of lower labor costs, came from the top.
And Frick, even though he was the operational expert running the show day to day, he resented Carnegie's ultimate authority.
Deeply, apparently. The sources say Frick bristled for decades under Carnegie's power as the majority stockholder, the one who ultimately controlled the finances and strategy. Frick could run the mills like a genius, but Carnegie owned the structure.
It's the enduring lesson, isn't it?
It really is. The operational expert executes, often brilliantly. But the person who controls the financial architecture, the ownership structure, the capital allocation process, they ultimately hold the trump cards. They dictate the strategy, the direction, and ultimately the fate of the enterprise. Financial process often dictates operational reality. #CAG outro.
So as we pull all these threads together, from McDonald's nailing down every single step, to Amazon building this massive scale engine, Milken rewriting the rules of finance, Vanderbilt strangling competitors with logistics, there's this really clear, persistent lesson, isn't there?
It seems inescapable. Time and again, the truly massive, enduring fortunes seem to be built not just on a clever product, but on innovating the business model, on mastering the how.
Yeah, how you control distribution, how you leverage assets, how you structure the finances, how you shape or navigate the market rules. That seems to be the more consistent differentiator.
And those core themes just keep repeating. Efficiency, achieving massive scale, and then strategically using that scale and structure, sometimes in ways that blur the lines between business, finance, and even politics.
You see it today, right? That $7 trillion prize projected for China in the AI race, that's a bet on a national process. Or those inexplicable exemptions for tycoons like Li Ka-shing, that's about how the regulatory process intersects with power.
Exactly. Whether it's the physical infrastructure of railroads, or the digital infrastructure of AI platforms, or the financial infrastructure built on Wall Street, the person or entity that masters that underlying structure, that process, they tend to be the ones who capture the lion's share of the wealth and influence.
The sources really drive home that lasting success often belongs to the master of logistics or the master of financial structure, maybe even more than the pure product visionary.
It's a compelling argument based on this history.
So, the final thought for you, the listener, navigating this complex world, what's the bigger risk you face today? Is it missing out on the next hot product idea? Or is it fundamentally underestimating the power of the often invisible financial processes, the logistical systems, the regulatory structures that actually underpin almost every single business?
Where should you really be focusing your attention to understand how value is created and captured? It's something worth thinking deeply about.